Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea from Game Informer, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. As you are listening to this episode, I am fresh off the plane back from Japan, so as I've done a few times this month, I am pre-recording this episode. However, it's a little serendipitous because, as you know, sometimes we do anniversary episodes when we have to do kind of a pre-record, and we do have a massive anniversary to celebrate. We will be talking all about the 35th anniversary of one of the most iconic video game systems of all time, the Game Boy. Joining me for this episode is former Game Informer editor and multiple-time All Things Nintendo guest, Bryan Vore. Bryan, how are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing great. I like these evening recordings. It's fun, everything is chill in the house, and I can really just focus.
Yeah, we could have called it ATN After Dark, but both of us, if you look at the video version, you can see that it is actually still light out because the sun sets pretty late these days in Minnesota.
That's right, and my kids don't believe it's really bedtime, so that's always fun.
Well, you can trick them into thinking like 4 p.m. is bedtime when winter rolls around.
It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt.
So, Bryan, this episode, we are celebrating the 35th anniversary of the Game Boy. And I imagine without this device, there are several people who might not even be listening to this podcast, or maybe they're not even going to be gamers at all. And, Nintendo's Game Boy did come out in Japan in April 1989. But as people are listening to this episode, it arrived on U.S. store shelves 35 years ago. So as such, we are going to use this episode to discuss the history and the lasting impact of the Game Boy. Before we kick things off, Bryan, what was your history with the Game Boy?
Well, I was such a big NES kid. I loved having full colors. I loved playing on a big TV. So when I saw people have Game Boys, I was like, oh, what do we have here? And then I was always kind of let down by the lack of backlighting and the blurry green screen and not being able to see things. And then on top of that, a lot of games were just kind of bad ports of considered real NES games. So my early Game Boy years were not kind to that system, but it all changed. And I'm sure you'll get to this when the Super Game Boy came out, because that had let you put a Game Boy up on your TV and you could see everything that was going on. And it was near the release somewhere, the Game Boy Color, so I could get a little bit more color and life to my games. But certainly since then, I've gone back and there's a lot of cool systems now. I don't have an analog pocket, but it is fun to play those old games on some of those cool little systems now that really make the old Game Boy titles shine.
Yeah, I mean, the Super Game Boy was kind of revelatory for me. And I was the same way, right? Like I've talked about it several times on this show, where I am 95% a console guy if I can help it, because same as you, I like having my stuff up on a big screen, bright colors, backlight, which we're going to talk a little bit about as we get through this episode. But yeah, I did not get a Game Boy until the Game Boy Color. That was my actual first Game Boy that I ever owned. I had a Game Gear prior to that because I was kind of like,
oh
yeah, well, we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. But yeah, I would always play my cousin's Game Boy, and we would go camping. We would do a big family camping trip every year, and my cousin would bring his Game Boy, and I'd be like, this is the coolest thing ever, except, I have this Game Gear that has color and a light and everything. And that's obviously so much better because the graphics are better. And I was an idiot. So
this was a time too, if people didn't live through this era, these machines, I think Game Boy was made the way it was to preserve battery life, right? You'd get some good hours out of that. But this was before the popularity and eras of, nice rechargeable batteries, even built-in rechargeables where you could just plug in the Game Boy and you'd be going through all these AA's, and parents were not happy about all that. But Game Gear, especially, I'm sure you know this firsthand, just ate those babies up.
It really did. It was absurd the rate at which I went through. I believe it was AAA batteries. I might be wrong. It might have been AA, but I think it was six AAA batteries,
Ooh.
which that's a lot of juice and a lot of I would imagine waste that is awful for the environment.
Yes, indeed. Did you
Uh,
know anyone that owned an Atari Lynx?
no, I don't, and I don't think most people know anybody who owned an Atari Lynx.
That was insane. They're like, this is the time we will figure out, hey, let's accommodate left-handed gamers and have be able to play either left-handed or right-handed. Like, it's one of those things where it's like everyone is just accepted that the D-pad's on the left and the buttons are on the right. You're not gonna reinvent the wheel here, guys. And also, didn't have a lot of great games. But there's so many silly handheld consoles in the past. But we're here to talk about the king of them all, right?
Yes, we are. And before we jump in, I did want to remind everyone that the best way to interact with the All Things Nintendo podcast is through the free Patreon page. It is the absolute best way to submit feedback, listener questions for episodes like the one we did a couple of weeks ago, and get clued into the latest news. For example, you may have heard 2 episodes ago that I have launched the All Things Nintendo merchandise store on tpublic.com. Have one of the items right here. If you're looking at the video version, it is the All Things Nintendo logo mug. Hey, it's actually pretty good quality. I just got it today. It arrived in the mail today. Quite a nice coffee mug, if I do say so myself. Also got myself a hoodie. But Patreon members heard about that first a few days before I announced it publicly. They also have the first crack at submitting those listener questions and get first reminders of new episodes being live. And as I've hinted in the past, we will be introducing paid tiers in the somewhat near future for bonus content and bonus perks. And it's also a great group of people over there. So be sure to head on over to Patreon and join the currently completely free All Things Nintendo page. And also, if you prefer the video versions, you can follow me on YouTube, where I'm pushing to hit 500 subscribers on the new channel. I am publishing like short, digestible clips as well as the video versions of the full episodes over there. So you can head to YouTube and join the cause there as well. All right, Brian.
Ryan, I
So
gotta congratulate you monetizing this son of a gun.
yeah, it's I mean, little by little, right? And we're trying to be as minimally invasive about it as possible. When I do take the show and have paid tiers added to the Patreon, the goal is to not take anything away from the free version, right?
Sure.
So, anything that is there already should still be there. That's my philosophy with it. And I want to still provide the same value to people who just want to listen to the show. And, so just trying to be mindful of that. And also, like, if people want more cool stuff from this show and the kind of the surrounding orbit of this show, then finding some cool ways to do that. So hopefully I'll have some more details on that in the future. On my last plane ride, I actually was sketching out potential Patreon tiers. So we're getting closer to the mark, but news when it's ready. I'll announce that.
Very
Um,
cool. Is the
yeah,
hoodie just have a giant picture of your face on it?
it is. It's me going. No, it's
Excellent.
just the same logo. There's several designs over there on TeePublic. There's one that there's a few that are like I made that were basically like models of controllers that you may recognize with the All Things Nintendo kind of abbreviated logo or the bar logo that you see. There's a couple that are just like, a little bit more slick. And there's just like the straightforward All Things Nintendo logo. So there's lots of stuff over there. Still going to continue brainstorming on design ideas. So yeah, go check that out if you would like to rep All Things Nintendo wherever it is that you live your life. So yeah, Brian, you ready to get into talking about the Nintendo Game Boy?
I sure am. And I'm glad I'm not being bamboozled in this episode because at Super Metroid, you went through the whole thing and didn't tell me you never played the game until the very end.
Wait. I've played it. I just have never beaten it.
Oh, you actually played some of it?
Oh yeah, I've played the first few hours several times.
Okay. Well, you should probably finish it. Have you
I
played it?
probably should.
Have you beaten it since we last talked?
No.
Come on, man.
With what time? That's the catchphrase of the show, unofficially. So if you're ready to jump into the Game Boy, Brian, I have bad news because we have to lay a little bit of the foundation here.
It's
So
always good to get a refresher on the old history.
Yeah, so prior to the Game Boy, Nintendo had actually released several handheld devices as part of its Game & Watch series. So a name we're going to be hearing a lot of in this episode is Gunpei Yokoi. So those Game & Watch devices were actually the creator of this guy. He's the designer. We covered him a lot in the Super Metroid episode because he actually supervised development of that game. But he joined Nintendo in 1965 to work on toys, which is just wild to think about. Like, somebody joining 1965 and also like, you know, creating something that was in, the mid 90s that is like still beloved to this day, and it's wild. But we're gonna dive a little bit into his career because he is instrumental to the creation of the Game Boy. So during that early stint with Nintendo, he created an extending arm toy known as the Ultra Hand, which you may know as the name for the Tears of the Kingdom power, where you can grab things. So the Ultra Hand was like this toy that you could extend out and it would grab stuff and you could pull it back to you. So that Ultra Hand being named that in Tears of the Kingdom is a nice little homage to Mr. Yokoi. So that toy was actually very successful, as was the Beam Gun, which he co-created, and that ended up being the predecessor to the NES Zapper. He also created the Love Tester, which was a device that was said to measure a couple's compatibility. I don't know how accurate that would be, but it was a fun novelty, I'm sure. So after a successful run working on toys, Yokoi joined a new branch of Nintendo devoted to creating video games in 1974. So Yokoi was one of the first game designers at Nintendo, and I did a bunch of research on his history and the history of the Game Boy, and so I'll be pulling from several articles here. So the first one that I found was a story on The Escapist called Searching for Gunpei Yokoi from 2007. So in that, it talks about how Yokoi was on the Shinkansen bullet train, which runs up and down Japan, on the way home from work. And he looked over and noticed that there was this businessman who was just bored on the train. And, this is in the 70s. So there's not like, we don't have phones. We don't have really any kind of portable entertainment. So he had just one of those old school LCD calculators and he was just pushing random buttons to pass the time and like, I don't know, doing whatever it is you could do with those things. So this sparked the idea in Yokoi's mind, wondering if a portable gaming device might be popular among commuters like this. And then there was an interview that kind of his partner in crime in this whole process, this assistant director Satoru Okada. And in this interview with Okada, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the future as well. But Nintendo's designers got a hold of Milton Bradley's Microvision, which was one of those older handheld devices as well. And they got this idea for creating these quick hit games that players could complete a game in a few minutes at most, but ideally just a few seconds. And then they could play it infinitely. And then they also looked at that and said, oh, we could probably use this technology for the screen. And then according to that escapist artist about Gunpei Yokoi, he actually preferred cheaper components, thinking that consumers would prefer affordable products with fun gameplay over expensive cutting edge technology. And Brian, does that sound familiar to you?
Sounds like those Tiger portable games.
I was thinking
have...
it sounds like Nintendo's current philosophy of
right. Oh, they're
affordable technology that emphasizes fun gameplay over cutting edge technology.
Yes. Does the philosophy sound the same? Yeah. Yeah. I never, of course, had a Game & Watch, but plenty of those Tiger games. That's what I filled the gap whenever I needed some out of the house gaming, and I look at them with rose tinted glasses, but they're not always the best. They weren't very good at all. I had
Which ones did you have?
Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden. Maybe had an X-Men. Like they hit all my hot properties, and I must have just convinced myself they were good because I kept getting them.
I don't know why I kept getting them. I think I had a Mortal Kombat one, or it was either Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter that I had. There was a Power Rangers one for sure. And then I also had a Sonic 3 Tiger Electronics handheld. None of them were good. None of them. I remember even like as a kid being like, man, this is not what I want to be playing. But like, it's a thing with like moving objects on a tiny little screen that also slightly resemble a property that I enjoy. So I guess I'll play it. It's better than nothing.
Yeah, it's better than just staring at the back of my parents, car,
Yeah.
car seat in a car. Yeah, or looking out the window. That sucks.
But yeah, like that philosophy is, I mean, I would say that's applied to every single Nintendo console since the Wii, but I would probably most notably on the Switch because, we talked about how like the Switch was pretty much an outdated piece of technology from a power perspective the day it launched. Like it didn't hold a candle to the Xbox One, or the PS4 that had come out years before, but because it was so versatile and had so many great games, it it became this juggernaut and is like one of the top selling consoles of all time. So Yokoi called this lateral thinking with obsolete technology. I've seen a few translations. One says obsolete technology, one says withered technology.
Mm,
So just kind of like, yeah, we're thinking with how can we create greatness with this kind of older, more affordable tech, and that sounds like the Switch to me.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, while you were getting your blast processing on Sega Genesis, I was still hanging out on the NES, having a lot of fun with all their great games.
I mean, you could say the same thing was true for the N64, right? Like a lot of the developers and the platform holders were moving over to CD at that point. Sega had moved on to the Sega CD and then eventually the Sega Saturn. PlayStation was just coming onto the scene. Both of those used CDs, and Nintendo was like, "No, we're going to stick with the cartridge and see what we can do out of that." And there were positives and negatives associated with that, but it's just another example of Nintendo kind of riding the wave of like this tried and true technology and kind of working to get the most out of it.
What's ironic compared to all the things we were just talking about is the cartridge N64 cartridges were ungodly expensive
Oh
compared
yeah,
to PlayStation discs.
yeah, that was the downside of it, honestly. So getting back to the handheld realm, the first Game and Watch, it was called Ball, and it came out in 1980, and then it was called Toss Up in the US. Ended up being one of the first major successes for Nintendo in the gaming sector. And then several additional Game and Watch devices with different games came out over the next few years. And the thing that is worth noting that every Game and Watch device was a separate individual game, right? So it wasn't like you bought one device and you could swap out cartridges or anything. That was not technology that Nintendo was utilizing at that point. So several games came out over the next few years, several Game and Watch devices, but Yokoi was pulled onto a new project as the supervisor of a brand new young designer named Shigeru Miyamoto. And in an Iwata Asks interview with for New Super Mario Brothers Wii, Miyamoto was like reminiscing on that era, and he said that Gunpei Yokoi was instrumental in explaining various game design conventions to him, and that Miyamoto also remembers that Yokoi went to bat for him early in his career. So, after Donkey Kong was a hit in arcades, they actually brought it to Game and Watch. But since it was more intricate than the previous Game and Watch titles, Yokoi had to figure out how to make it so that that game could be played without an arcade joystick. Because if you put an arcade joystick on this thing, it's not going to be portable. Do you know what the solution was, Bryan Vore?
Ooh, I don't think I do.
It was an innovative invention that was a plus sign shaped directional pad, or a D pad for short.
Oh man, they weren't on any other Game and Watch before then?
No, they were like little nubs almost.
Oh.
And it wasn't the first time a directional pad had been used in gaming, but it was the first time that we had seen the now iconic plus sign or cross design that Nintendo and pretty much every other console manufacturer has used in the time since.
Oh, was it like four separate dots before for
Yeah,
everybody
it was.
else?
Well, there were like some that were like circular. There were some that were like the separate buttons. But yeah, this was the first time that we had seen the plus sign uh, design. Plus sign
Okay.
design is a tongue twister.
Now, should we? It was Miyamoto came from a art background. Is that correct? And that's why he didn't really. I mean, no one. There was not like a game design school back then or anything, so no one really had that opportunity to like study gaming unless you were actively in a company, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to several developers from that era, and like, yeah, like going into the '90s, there weren't really many game design courses. Like they were becoming more prominent than they were in the '80s, but like, it was still kind of a rarity, and like a lot of people would just go for like programming, or they would go for like different kinds of like art backgrounds, like you said. But yeah, it wasn't really like a thing that was prominent in the early '90s at least, and it certainly wasn't prominent in like 1980 or whenever Miyamoto graduated. So yeah, I mean, it just seems like Gunpei Yokoi had learned through like trial and error and making these Game and Watch games, like how can you make a game that's fun, and imparted that wisdom on the young designers, one of which happened to be Shigeru Miyamoto.
Nice.
So shortly after that, Nintendo released its iconic home console, the Famicom, or the NES in the West, which also used that D-pad design. And this was also when Nintendo started using cartridge technology, which had been invented by electronic engineer Jerry Lawson in the 1970s. And this made it so that you could swap out games on existing hardware. And even though Nintendo experienced a ton of success with the NES, Yokoi actually had said over and over that he remained partial to handheld technology.
Mm.
So
Did old Jerry, did he work for Atari, or who did he work for to
no,
implement
he
carts for the first
God, what
time?
was the name of the console that he helped design?
Was it
It
in
was like,
television?
no, it was something called like Channel F, the Fairchild Channel F.
Ah, yes, yes, yes.
So yeah, he was the inventor of cartridge technology. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He passed away in 2011. But yeah, he's one of the unsung heroes of video game like forefathers, I would say. Just creating the thing that we are still using to this day. The Switch uses cartridges. Um, and yeah, just an unbelievable legend that doesn't get enough shine there. That's why I wanted to make sure to shout him out on this episode as well, because I don't want to talk about like, oh, Nintendo first started using cartridges in the NES, and then like not touch on the man who made that all possible.
For sure. Yeah. And
So
then
the '80s
it's
continued
interesting.
on. Oh, go
It's
ahead.
interesting to note too. Like during what late Game and Watch pre home console era, Nintendo had, as you mentioned with Donkey Kong, like a pretty prominent arcade business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Made made possible mostly by Donkey Kong, but um, Miyamoto also did the art for Arcade Punch Out, right?
I think he did. Right? Is that true?
Yeah, he worked on it with like an anime art house to like get all the frames and designs they needed, because it was like probably some of the, I think Punch Out had some of the biggest characters that you could get at the time. Like the character sprites were enormous because of the tech they used. But I suppose that's a little bit of diversion because we are focused on the portable systems right now.
I did look it up, and he did actually do the art for Punch Out, the arcade edition. So good call out there. So Nintendo continued to iterate on the Game and Watch form factor. I think I read that like over the first like 10 or 11 years of the Game and Watch's existence, they released 59 different Game and Watch devices,
Hmm.
which is a lot.
I
um,
wish I had at least one in the package still.
oh God, they did release those Game and Watch special editions. There's like the Super Mario Brothers and the Legend of Zelda ones, where it plays like the NES games on like a full color Game and Watch screen. I don't know if you remember that from like probably 2020 and 2021.
Yeah, I grabbed a couple. I grabbed those.
Oh man, I kind of wish I did. Those were cool. I don't think I'd ever play them, but they'd be cool things to have.
Yeah, they're pretty sweet. They got a nice. I know at least Zelda has a nice gold box, but maybe Mario does too. That might have
Mm.
been just the branding. But yeah, I wish they would have kept going with those. I mean, those are, I guess, they're two big iconic properties, but it would be fun to see that continue on.
Yeah, and I mean, they have paid homage to Game and Watch several times over the course of Nintendo's history. I mean, they still acknowledge how influential these devices are. So they continued iterating the form factor of the Game and Watch over the course of the '80s. So they gave versions with wider screens. They added the D-pad. They've created more advanced games. But then shortly after the NES arrived on Western shores in 1985, Nintendo Research and Development 1, which Yokoi was a part of, got to work on designing the next handheld gaming device. And as I mentioned before, his partner in crime for this venture was Satoru Okada, who acted as assistant director. And then I found a 2017 interview with Retro Gamer with Satoru Okada, and he had mentioned there was originally a huge disagreement between him and Yokoi about the direction that the Game Boy should go. And I found a quote from that interview on Internet Archive through a
Ooh,
now defunct site called Japanese Nintendo. And you ready for this? 'Cause it's kind of a long one, so buckle in a little bit.
okay.
Here's from Okada. Quote, "The Game Boy you know today actually had nothing to do with the one Yokoi had in mind. He saw the Game Boy as a direct follow-on from the Game & Watch, which meant a rather cheap toy without any real business model and no long-term ambition. To give you a clear comparison, Yokoi wanted a Game Boy that would have looked like the Microvision, which was that the old handheld device that they looked at back in the 70s when they were creating the Game & Watch, and would not have lasted more than one or two seasons. For instance, he did not care if there were third-party editors or not. Furthermore, he only wanted quick games, quickly completed and quickly forgotten. I wanted the Game Boy to have more ambition, closer to what the R&D 2 team had managed with the Famicom, a machine built to last with hardware that was good enough to play a variety of quality titles. I was the assistant director of R&D 1, and we had many arguments over this. In the end, he gave in and angrily told me, 'Okay, do what you want.' I then asked him, 'Fine, but are you giving me full responsibility?' And he said yes. I made the Game Boy project my own. Yokoi gave his seal of approval. In the end, the Game Boy is much more similar to the Famicom than the Game & Watch. The hardware was good enough to offer a wide range of games, and we were ready to welcome third-party editors with real development kit, instruction booklets, some real support, etc." So that's
I'm glad it went.
that's quite a quote there, quite a story.
I'm glad it went that direction.
Yeah, me too. Like, could you imagine a world where it's just like, like the Game Boy is just like a slightly better Game and Watch?
I don't know how you'd pull that off with multiple cartridges, and because it was fun, when you looked at those Tiger games, if you held them up and looked at them a certain angle, you could see all the different art on how and it was filled to the brim, like all the different possible animations for every character and
Oh
every
yeah,
enemy and every background element, every projectile. And it was all just jammed in. You could just see. So I guess I don't know how it would have been interesting to see Yokoi's vision on how that would have worked, but I think we can all agree that the version of Game Boy that we ended up getting ultimately in reality was the way to go for sure.
yeah, and it. I can't help but think that it would have been probably close to those Tiger Electronics games that actually, I don't know if you've noticed, they're making a comeback. You can buy Tiger Electronics games. Like every once in a while I see Wario64 tweeting out like, this Tiger Electronics game is available at Best Buy or whatever. It's just like, why? I have nostalgia for those things too, but I don't think I would ever, unless I was like, there was like one that was perfectly in my niche. I cannot possibly imagine like buying another one of those, especially to play. Maybe just if I have a display case off to the side over here, and I have like a Pokemon and like Mario and Zelda and Sonic and all these different compartments in the display case. Maybe I would buy like a newer version of the Sonic one just to keep in the box and put in the Sonic cube. But like, I can't imagine actually playing one of those in 2024.
Yeah, I picked one up just for nostalgia's sake, but surprise, I never got around to opening it and actually playing it.
Which one did you pick up?
I I think I got the X-Men one.
Okay, nice.
I think it's around somewhere on a shelf of stuff.
But yeah, so Okada's design philosophy is what he felt set him apart, because he felt that making hardware that appealed to a wider range of people was the way to appeal to specific markets as well. So there was a 2014 interview with STG Gameside, which is another Japanese outlet, and it was translated by Shmupulations. If you're not familiar with that, it's kind of a Patreon supported archive of translated Japanese interviews, which has been a gold mine for a lot of my research episodes. And in that
Wow,
interview,
that's
you've never
really
heard of
cool.
this?
I never heard of it.
Yeah, it's a really like rich site. You can search on like interview subjects and everything. It's very cool. So I typed in Okada and I was just like reading these interviews with him and like seeing what I could find. So in that interview with STG Gameside, Okada said, quote, "When I made things for children, I didn't try to make it from the perspective of a child. Instead, I made something that we adults at Nintendo would enjoy ourselves." Which I feel like that's a really good way to approach things, because like it's almost like when you see somebody talking to a little kid, right? And you're just like, and they kind of put on the baby voice and they're kind of like talking in like tiny little words and like not treating them like a human, right? And then somebody comes along and like just treats them like a peer instead of like treating them like a little baby, and the kid immediately is drawn to that person because they're talking to them like a real person. It's not like, "Oh, how was your day today, little guy?" And it's
Hmm.
like, no, it's like, "Hey, what's up? How you doing?" And they're immediately like, "Oh, this guy's cool. He thinks like I'm an adult." And I feel like that's kind of the way kids can suss out these people, right? Where it's like they can also do that same thing with their entertainment. It's like, "Oh, this was designed for like an intelligent human being. It's not just like kids software, right?"
Yeah. I think it's easy with kids games too. Like they still make them, some of them like this, but you see like when someone puts a lot of depth into something like a Fortnite or Pokemon, where it's like kids hunger for that depth and complexity, and they don't just want simple things where you just, I don't know, bop dudes on the head and have a bunch of pretty colors. Those have a place, but I think kids yearn for like what some of the older kids are doing or what the adults are playing. So having that complexity there is really compelling.
Yeah, I mean, you're a father, I'm not, but I've seen enough kids like sometimes they'll want to play like games made for kids, but other times they'll be like, "Oh, I want to play what the older kids or the adults are playing." And like having the ability to give them something that they can play that's at least approximating those types of experiences, I think is a great way to appeal to them.
For sure.
And Okada got his way, right? Like Yokoi wanted kind of something a little bit cheaper, a little bit more disposable, I guess is the best way to put it. But Yokoi's philosophy of using the less expensive technology to make the product more affordable rather than relying on cutting edge technology and then kind of making sure that the gameplay was on point, that was still the prevailing principle. So kind of like their philosophies came together to create this device. And Yokoi specifically wanted to ensure, and this is a point that you made earlier, Vore, that the battery life of the Game Boy would last longer than its contemporaries. And that ended up being the right call because the competitors' products that we mentioned earlier, the Sega Game Gear, the Atari Lynx, those handhelds were just destroying batteries, rapid rates, and were also much more expensive. So even though Game Gear and Lynx had full color screens, backlit, like beautiful graphics, neither was anywhere near as popular as the Game Boy. And do you think that's kind of the main reason why, or do you think it's kind of the games, or do you think it's just the entire package?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy, I think, in gaming magazines to show off those cool color graphics, and I don't blame Sega and Atari for going that direction. It's like, this is an easy win. Why didn't they make cool color portables? I mean, this is going to be slam dunk. But you know, as in many cases, like if you don't have that top tier Nintendo development, you don't have. I mean, I'm sure you're going to get into this game, but Tetris was an extreme factor in Game Boy's early success, at least. Um, and then, yeah, I mean, you just don't understand. Like those AA batteries, burning them off. People were probably throwing them straight in the trash, like causing terrible acid landfills. Probably throwing them right in the fire, exploding acid. Like people didn't know proper battery care. That's like a constant expense. It's not like a Nintendo where like you're paying for electricity, I guess, but you outside of having to buy new games, you don't have this constant expense going. So um, I really commend their complete dedication, because I know they went through many rounds of just trying to get that battery life up and up and up and up. I know there was a lot of R&D where it was just like still not good enough, still not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And where they ended up was right in that sweet spot.
Yeah, and that notion of affordability and battery life, that was front and center with pretty much every part of the design of the Game Boy.
Do you
The
remember
form
the do you
form
know
factor.
the cost? What was the launch cost? Was it
We'll get to that.
okay? All
Yeah.
right.
So, but one of the main ways that they cut on the affordability and boosted the battery life was something that still makes it difficult for me to pick up a Game Boy and play it today, and that is not having a backlight. And Nintendo originally planned to partner with CPU manufacturer Ricoh for the CPU due to its wide-ranging compatibility, but it ultimately chose to work with the more affordable Sharp Corporation. And then Nintendo also decided to include the D-pad from the later Game & Watch devices. And since the NES used it, it actually worked out in their favor big time, because many of the Nintendo developers already knew how to develop games using that kind of input, and players already had that familiarity of how to play a game using a D-pad. So I mean, that was really smart having that kind of synergy, because like it's a no-brainer these days. Like, that's such a uniformed control method in this day and age. But like back then, it was like, oh, it's a new system. Maybe we do a new device. Like Atari had its paddle, and then like it didn't. And there's all these different input mechanisms. And Nintendo kind of had the amazing foresight to be like, well, what if we just put this same control method on every single thing and started iterating on how we create games in this way?
Yeah, it was great. I don't know if I can't remember. Did the color have a backlight?
It did not.
So it still didn't. So here's what I had to do. This is fast forwarding to a different era. I was holding off on buying Game Boy Advance forever until Metroid Fusion came out, and then I couldn't stop anymore. But I had to fall into that trap of like, this was a tradition going back to this original Game Boy. You have to buy these stupid magnifying glasses
Yeah, with the
that
light.
that would have a light that would shine on the screen. It sucked. It made it suck slightly less. Like you could play at night,
Mm-hmm.
but it'd magnify the screen a little bit, shine a bit of light on it. They had these dumb like bendy lights that would shine down. So it was just a whole other set of batteries you had to buy and put in there. But all these weird accessories that you had to buy. And it wasn't a pleasant experience, but it made the Game Boy a little bit more usable outside of the normal daylight hours. And that transferred that light power usage to a different device, so you still had that lengthy gameplay battery life. But those things were terrible. Did you use any of those?
Oh yeah. I remember, so we would go over to my grandparents' house quite a bit when I was living in Maryland as a kid. And they lived like, I think it was like a 35-minute drive, so it wasn't super short, but it wasn't like really long. It wasn't like a marathon, but it was close enough that we would go there probably a couple times a week. And I still remember like I would be playing Pokemon or whatever game I was playing, and when it's nighttime, your options are either don't play, turn on like the dome light in the car, which if you ever did that when your parents were driving, they acted like this is the end of our lives. Or you get one of those little devices. And I think my parents quickly realized that the drive home from my grandparents was a lot more fun when I was occupied by a Game Boy than, or when I wasn't trying to turn on the dome light and make it so they couldn't see outside of the car. And so I did have one of those, and it was the greatest invention ever. And I was like, oh, it'd be a lot easier if this was like my Game Gear and it had like a light in the screen itself. But it didn't.
Yeah. And when you're at home, you can like maybe find a table lamp and sit crouched under that. But even then, you would have to worry about the glare from the lamp or the light that you were using. So it was really a tough solution.
It was. So all this stuff was locked in now. The concept was finalized. And just like Gunpei Yokoi did with Shigeru Miyamoto, when Miyamoto had this idea for Donkey Kong, Yokoi went to President Hiroshi Yamauchi and convinced him, like, hey, give this guy Shigeru Miyamoto like a real shot, like give this game Donkey Kong, like give it funding, like make it so this project can become a reality, because I think it's something pretty cool. And so he did that back then. He once again did this, where he went to Hiroshi Yamauchi and convinced the then president of Nintendo to fund the Game Boy product. And then I found a 2015 article on French publication Le Monde called NX Ultra 64 Nitro, Petite Histoire de Nintendo à travers ses noms de code, which is, basically an abbreviated history of Nintendo's working code names, is what that roughly translates to in French. And
I applaud you attempting to pronounce French words.
well, I used to speak French. I
Really?
used to. I mean, it's been 20 years, but yeah, I mean, I'm basically completely illiterate at this point, but I could translate that, I believe. Hopefully nobody's going to write in and be like, oh, you were an idiot.
French and Canadian people are historically easygoing about pronunciation of all their words, so I'm sure you'll be fine.
So I did not run that through Google Translate, so if I messed that up, I apologize to any French listeners or French Canadian listeners. So according to that article, several members of Nintendo actually started calling it Dame Game, I believe is how it's pronounced in Japanese, with Dame meaning hopeless in Japanese. Basically, they didn't think the handheld device that played cartridges the way that Yokoi and Okada envisioned was even feasible, which is not a great sign when your coworkers are like, give it up, it's not going to happen. But hey, Yamauchi funded it. And then in that 2014 interview with STG Gameside that I referenced earlier, Okada said, I think the spirit of an era is something we make ourselves. For my generation, there was no opposition to us starting something new, so we were able to create that spirit ourselves. Nowadays, to do anything, there's so much bureaucracy and red tape that new ideas get crushed before they even have a chance. It's vital that developers make prototypes. Without a prototype, you don't know where the solution to the problems with your ideas might lie, nor do you even know where to look in the first place. And I found this to be a common thread with a lot of Okada's interviews that I was reading, is like, he is just so fed up with like all the corporate red tape that exists these days. Like, I mean, he's no longer with Nintendo, but every interview, it seems he gets onto the topic of like, oh, developers can't take chances anymore because there's so much red tape, and like they have ideas and people just crush them before that even gets off the ground. So yeah, it seems like a thing that helped him a lot with creating the Game Boy, and him like going back now and being like, oh, this would never happen in the modern era.
Yeah, it's tough to think about. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about that early time in gaming where really you didn't need a ton of resources to program a game. Like, games were regularly made by just a small group, and sometimes even one person, back when they were so simple. But it's not really possible as much anymore. I mean, you see the random indie game that at least starts out with one or two people, like Vampire Survivors or Mini Shoot Adventures. But even then, like, once they get rolling, it's like, well, maybe I'll bring in some more people for this and this and this and this. But yeah, it was cool, that kind of frontier era where it seemed like anything was possible, and you were only kind of limited by, the higher ups and how willing they were to take a risk and try to get the next new big thing, instead of, trying to emulate Pac-Man or something like that, like chasing the hits, when you could kind of make your own completely new experience.
It's interesting that you bring up trying to emulate Pac-Man because in those interviews that I was reading, and that one of the Iwata asks for New Super Mario Brothers Wii, it was a conversation between Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto pointed out that like the original idea for Donkey Kong was actually something very similar to Pac-Man, and he wanted to do something different intentionally, so he changed that idea, which
Oh, that's
I thought
cool.
was a very interesting thing. And also, that started out as Popeye. It wasn't. It was originally Popeye trying to rescue Olive Oil from Bluto, and then they couldn't get the Popeye license, so he created Donkey Kong and Mario, or Jumpman at the time. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff in those Iwata Asks interviews. I mean, the Popeye thing is more well known than just that interview, but yeah,
Those
it's
are such a gold mine, and it's so sad that they don't exist anymore. Or like you can't make new ones, of course.
yeah. I mean,
Rest in peace, Iwata.
I just saw
Um,
that a couple weeks ago was actually the 9th anniversary of his passing.
sheesh, that's gone by really fast.
I know Reggie actually tweeted it out, and I was like, man, has it really? And I guess it makes sense because that was my first year at Game Informer that happened.
Oh wow. So you never did you go to any Nintendo Iwata press conferences before?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, they were a lot of fun. I was
No,
in a good
that's
era of in-person press conferences, but I realize now I was very lucky about that. But
yeah.
to go back to Popeye for a moment, they eventually did get that Popeye license and
Hmm.
made a totally different. It was still like Popeye running around and Bluto being a Donkey Kong style villain, but he would come down and come after you, and you would catch Olive Oil's hearts. I I never played it in the arcade or anything, but um, there was one time when we were hanging out playing Nintendo, and my dad is like, "Oh, hey, check out this catalog of other Nintendo games. Like, what do you think is cool? What do you think is cool?" And we're like, "Oh, hey, we watched the Popeye cartoon. That's a great show. I bet that game is cool." And he's like, "Oh yeah, well, that does sound pretty cool, doesn't it?" And you know, he produced it from somewhere. And we're like, "Whoa, how did you get that? Or how did you know that we would like that?" So I remember having my mind blown in that at that early age. My brother and I played the hell out of that Popeye game. Like you go back to it now, and it's not anything crazy. It's very much like Donkey Kong, where there's like, I believe, 4 stages that just start over again, but it's somehow it's somehow highly addictive, and you get that spinach power up. Of course, it like lends itself so naturally to video games, and you can go and just punch the crap out of Bluto. So it is very much, it is kind of a blend of Donkey Kong and Pac-Man, where you get the pill, and so suddenly the tables are turned on the enemy.
Yeah, I don't think I ever played that Popeye game, but I know it exists, and I played the crap out of Donkey Kong. So yeah, it's cool to see that legacy live on, even though like if they did get that Popeye license early on, we might not have Mario today.
Oh yeah, because then they would be all tied to that.
Yeah,
Very
because they'd be like,
interesting.
"Oh, we got our hit through Popeye."
Yeah, they would be stuck with that. Not stuck, but they'd be kind of like put of all that resource
Wonder what the
into
world
someone
looks
else's
like.
IP.
Yeah, I wonder what the world looks like where Nintendo never finds Mario. Like, would Zelda have been enough to like bolster the NES to the point that like people would buy it and Nintendo would be the juggernaut that they are today? Like that's like a Nexus event, right? Is like Nintendo does not get the Popeye license.
Yeah, little butterfly effect. Uh, I don't know. I think at some point they would have wanted to create a human being video game character that is not, and they're not going to have Popeye be the star of every game. And
That
then
would
they're
be
going to have,
very funny if Popeye
yeah,
was the Mario of video games in an alternate reality.
that would be cool. And then I think the mustache as a solution to like show face detail in that era. So if not Mario, some human male with a mustache. Maybe he wouldn't have been a plumber. I don't know. But I feel like it would have gotten there at some point.
I wish nothing more than I could do a Popeye impression right now, because I would say it's a me Popeye, but
Mm.
it's not worth attempting on this podcast. Not in front of a recording microphone.
Yeah, that's probably for the best, Bry.
Yeah, I thought about it very briefly, and I was like, nope, not going to try it. So getting back, remember, Damu Game was the unofficial code name of the Game Boy, which meant hopeless. Hopeless game, I guess, would be the way that they would be referred to there. The real code name was actually Dot Matrix Game, or DMG, which referred to the type of screen technology they used. And
Mm.
then during the development of the Game Boy, Okada pulled upon his prior experience of working on a game that Nintendo point out in the early 80s called Computer Mahjong Yakuman, which let players connect two devices using a cable. And Okada thought that idea would work well for the Game Boy. And then there was this 2022 interview with 4Gamer that Okada did, saying that there was internal pushback because they thought the technology would be too challenging to implement in the programming. And then Okada believed in the idea so much, and this is going back to that original idea that we were talking about like kind of these grassroots development efforts. He believed in this idea of a link cable so much that he went ahead and just created it himself.
Hmm.
And then he created, also on top of the link cable, he created a few prototype games to show the higher ups how it would work, which is just
Oh, wow.
absurd. He just did this like kind of on his spare time. And that's how the Game Boy link cable was born. And Game Boy was first introduced to the public in 1987 across various expos and trade shows. And Okada also pushed Nintendo to make development tools available to third-party developers, which was considered one of the shortcomings of the NES's launch. And Nintendo listened because they wanted to bolster the lineup, which already consisted of Super Mario Land, which honestly was probably stretching the team a little thin, because that was also directed by Okada and produced by Gunpei Yokoi. And then so they farmed it out to third party developers, and the most prominent example was this game called Tetris, which was brought to Nintendo by Hank Rogers. And I highly encourage you. Have you seen the Tetris movie, Brian?
I really want to, but I did read a book about Tetris creation. So I think it covers a lot of the same, but I really want to. That's on Apple.
It's on Apple
Right?
TV Plus. I enjoyed it. I mean, it's funny because I came out of it and I was like, I don't wonder how faithful that was. And this past June, I was at a Tetris 40th anniversary party at in LA at Summer Game Fest timeframe, and I actually met both Hank Rogers and Tetris creator Alexei Pajitnov. And I met Alexei, and he was like asking me like, "Oh, what was the first Tetris that you played?" And I told him it was the NES version. That was like one of my entryways into gaming. And he's like, "Have you seen the Tetris movie?" And I said, "Yeah." And apologies for the bad Russian accent I'm about to do, but he leaned into me and he goes, "It's quite faithful, aside from all the Hollywood bullshit." So I don't know what to make of that, because is it faithful or is it BS? I don't know. But I had fun with that very brief conversation that I had with Lexi Pajitnov. And the Game Boy version of Tetris was adapted from his original version. But guess what? It was directed by Okada and produced by Yokoi. So
Yeah,
it was,
dream team.
they really were like they kept the Game Boy afloat in its early years, it seems.
It
And
was
because
like a crazy maze getting those rights, right?
Oh my God, yeah. It again, either read the book that Brian is talking about or watch the Apple TV movie. It is absurd, like the drama that had to happen in order to get those rights, because the Soviet Union was like trying to keep it like a Soviet property, and like they didn't want to work with a foreign company like Nintendo. And then Nintendo of America was involved heavily, and Howard Lincoln was trying to get involved. So it was just a nightmare. And like, Hank Rogers had to go over to the Soviet Union, which you were not supposed to do in that point as an American. And it became like this dangerous thing where he was being followed. And yeah, definitely go read up on the fight that Nintendo and Hank Rogers had to do to get the rights to Tetris. to put it on their systems. So because it fit a portable system so well, Nintendo of America president and founder, by the way, he was the founder of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, decided to offer it as a bundled option with the Game Boy everywhere but Japan. So Nintendo now had a couple of incredible titles. The Game Boy was ready to launch. Try to put yourself in the shoes of Nintendo, Brian. You have a Mario game and a little known puzzle game from the Soviet Union. Without the foresight to see what Tetris would go on to become, are you feeling confident with this launch?
They just those two games and that's it.
I mean, they had a few other games, but those are the heavy hitters, I would say. Like those are the two that Nintendo rests most of its faith. It put most of its faith in there, right? Because Mario, that was an established, known quantity. Even though this was like a lesser version than what we were getting on the NES. And then Tetris, they went through all this trouble because they believed in it so much to get it get the license from the Soviet Union into Nintendo of America. How are you feeling going into this launch?
Well, I think they had a lot of confidence coming off the NES with Super Mario Brothers being such a runaway hit that knowing that, oh, we got a Mario game, we're all set. That's not always a guarantee in the modern era to have Mario ready to go. Sometimes the timing works out when a new Nintendo console comes out, but it's always great to see when it does line up. And then I think the thing about Tetris is everyone scoffs at it in that area until they play it themselves and they're like, oh my God, I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop playing it. I think they knew that it would be a huge word of mouth hit. And also, a portable system like an NES, you have to be like, hey, bud, why don't you come all the way to my house and sit in front of my TV and we'll play this game together. You have to see it. Versus I'm out in the world playing this Tetris game and, maybe I'm on the subway and someone's like peeking over the shoulder like, oh, what is that? Or maybe you just took it to work and you're like, you guys, you have to try this at lunch break today. It just, and it's a great way to like, A, this game rules, and B, being able to see the technology of the Game Boy, which hadn't been seen before. So it was a great way to sell it. And obviously that did very well.
And what incredible foresight by Nintendo to be like, you know what? People know Mario. They will go out of their way to buy a Mario game. People have no idea what this Tetris game is, by and large. Maybe a few clued in people knew about it. But like, they're like, oh, let's just pack it in with the Game Boy and make it so everybody who gets a Game Boy, or I mean, you could buy it standalone, but like the Tetris bundle was the more popular version, if I'm not mistaken. They would just have this game and they'd be like, well, let me try it out. I have this game anyway. And then they knew people were just going to be hooked as soon as they fired it up. And then, like you said, the word of mouth would start spreading. You got to check out this Game Boy game called Tetris. And, it became a massive hit because of that.
Yeah. I mean, it really was, there were a few games here and there that would break through to the popular culture, to people who there were, of course, the gamer nerds of every era, but just the random everyday people, like Pac-Man famously got people like, well, I don't really get what these video game things are, but Pac-Man is awesome and I want to play it forever. Tetris was another big landmark of this. Just like it didn't matter what age you were, you'd hear all these stories of just like, oh, my mom keeps stealing my Game Boy because of Tetris, like it would just a phenomenon. And, you'd see that later with a thing like, the original Wii, just like the way it would reach a popular consciousness and be very accessible and just like instantly exciting to anyone who saw it.
Yeah, I mean, those were the two games that my mom played, right? Like the Miss Pac-Man in particular, and then Tetris. Those are the two games that she is like very good at and poured a ton of time into like in the 80s. And I remember her playing those games. Like we would go to arcades and like it was always like, all right, well, you were good while we were out. You can have $2 at the arcade. And then like while I was playing, sometimes she would just meander over to the Miss Pac-Man cabinet or the Tetris cabinet and just, put a few tokens in and have at it, and it'd be like, oh, you're actually pretty good at this game, Mom. And yeah, it's one of those like just wide-reaching games that just everybody, like you referenced the Wii, everybody could just pick it up and immediately understand the concepts and immediately just like go for it. It was a pick up and play experience at its finest, and might be one of the better examples of that, right?
For sure, yeah.
All right, Brian. So we have covered the creation and development and design and lead up to the launch of the Game Boy. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the Game Boy's release, its biggest games, and its legacy. We will be right back. The Game Boy launched in Japan on April 21st, 1989, and then eventually came to the US on July 31st, 1989. The final design was a large gray rectangle with a dot matrix display that displayed monochromed images with a yellow background, as well as a single speaker, 2 face buttons, and the iconic D-pad. Brian, what do you think about this form factor?
Well, obviously it's an iconic look, right? Maybe looking back, possibly not the most ergonomic, but it worked okay for little kid hands, and you had that chunky bottom, so you could get your hands up and around it. It's been nice to have, even the Switch, they do add-ons to make it more ergonomic, so you have those kind of smooth pieces of plastic that fill up your palm nicely. That would have made it weird, though. I think it's worth the trade-off of the Game Boy is so iconic. You just see that, you can see a pixelated, blurry version of it, and you know exactly what it is. Like, it's tough to beat that. It's tough to beat it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most iconic looking just pieces of video game hardware ever. Like, there's pictures of like celebrities playing with it. Like, it was such a cultural phenomenon. And I think it's outside of maybe like, oh man, like where does it rank in terms of like just the form factor, the most immediately recognizable hardware in gaming history? Like, is it the most recognizable piece of gaming hardware?
Quite possibly.
I feel like everybody, like you,
though, I bet a lot of young people, for a decent amount of young people, have never heard of the Game Boy or played it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
for
I feel like it
timers,
still has a bit of a pop culture cachet about it, right? Like, I don't know. Like, it seems like maybe I'm trying to like put myself in the shoes of somebody 25 years younger than me. It's not happening. It's not working.
Sometimes I have to remember there's people that don't know all the old man stuff that I know. I'm like, wait, I gotta rewind and be like, if I was born in 2010 or the year 2000, like, why would I know all a bunch of game stuff that I would never play these old games? They look, quote, kind of crappy compared to today's stuff, like,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to put myself in that headspace. So like, I think as a video game historian, maybe if you're interested in looking back on that, and there's good call outs, I think, in things like Smash Brothers, right? I'm sure there's like Game Boy appearances and all over that to like help give people that history, right?
Yeah, a lot of the games these days have like those museum modes, right? Where it's like you can kind of check out like either like sound or old art or advertisements from magazines. Like, those are great. I wish Nintendo would do more of that, honestly. Like we saw with Atari 50. That is such a amazing compilation. I'm tooting their horn once more. Digital Eclipse did an amazing job. I would like, the dream would be like Digital Eclipse doing like Nintendo 50, even though Nintendo's been along for a lot longer than 50 years, because they were a toy manufacturer and a card manufacturer and a hotel company long before they were in video games. But I digress. Like maybe once we get to, I mean, I guess this might be the 50th anniversary. This year might be the 50th anniversary because that was when Yokoi was pulled into the nascent gaming sector of Nintendo. Was 1974. Well,
Okay.
it's time for that Nintendo 50 digital eclipse. Hit them up.
Well, we do have, what is that? That Nintendo championship.
Nintendo World Championships. Yeah, we talked about it last week's episode.
It's kind of a celebration of history,
It
right?
is and it isn't because it's more of like a.
It's not as it's
It's
like a
kind of like
remix.
WarioWare meets NES Remix
Yeah, it's
meets
not
Super
really
Mario
like
35.
this game came out in this year, and here's some magazine articles about it and all that.
Yeah,
Was it
Virtual
Digital?
Museum would be incredible.
Did Digital Eclipse? They did that Ninja Turtles compilation too.
Yeah, Cowabunga
I,
Collection.
I love this trend. There used to just be like, okay, here's a remake of the NES version of whatever, DuckTales or something. I love now that they're like, we're going to put every possible version of this game on this collection. So it's like, okay, you get the Super Nintendo version, you get the Genesis version, you get the Game Boy version, you get, I don't know if there's a Game Gear, like
Yeah.
it's the one game, but you get every weird little port of it and just get to like play around with just the small differences or large differences in many cases.
Yeah. I mean, I love that the Cowabunga Collection does that because, there's Tournament Fighters that has the SNES and Genesis versions that were very well known. And then there's like, oh, yeah, they also did an NES version of that game. And then there's Turtles in Time, and it's the SNES version or the arcade version. Oh, you can play both. And that was super cool. And then also they had cheat codes built into all of them. And you could like adjust the filters. You could do like, you could make it so that like, all right, well, you have God mode in the NES game. If you always wanted to get through it to the end and see this pretty difficult game through, you can do that now with these cheat codes and add like different modifiers to these classic games. And so it's not like a remake, but it's an easier way to experience these games if you're not like into like the super punishingly difficult nature of some of these older games in particular before like all of the best practices that we know today were discovered.
Yeah, putting in these fun tools really helps rekindle the history. And B, uh, if you put in fun bells and whistles that you can't get through straight emulation, which was kind of the only way to experience some of these things in the past, you put in those. It's like the Napster when it was like, all right, I can download these MP3s for free, or like iTunes made it simple to buy them legally. Like we have to make it as easy or easier than the pirate way of doing things.
Mm-hmm.
So this approach is great. I know it's way more work to get all the rights, and I know they do tons of work to go through archives and get so many cool records and scan them into the game. So I just want to say I appreciate what Digital Eclipse does, and any other companies out there who are really putting in the extra blood, sweat, and tears to resurface some of these old great games.
Absolutely. And they also have that Power Rangers game that looks pretty cool that they announced at Summer Game Fest. That's their own creation. I mean, they've done some great original stuff as well, not just like old compilations. They've done some fantastic original development projects too. So very much looking forward to that. Speaking of games, Brian, the launch lineup. Let's get to that. In Japan, it consisted of Alleyway, Baseball, Super Mario Land, and Yakuman. And the US lineup didn't get Yakuman, but it did get Tetris and Tennis. So I think they won that one. But it did come out a few months later, so it makes sense that they would have Tetris because Tetris launched alongside the US release. And then reception. Initially, the Game Boy was criticized for not having color or a backlight and for being bigger than other handheld gaming devices at the time. But the sales proved that the people who were criticizing it were pretty much just dead wrong. And the lower price, which, what do you think it cost back then? You want to take a guess?
Why am I thinking like and to be fair, I did not go and look up stats like you did. So
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm better than you.
I'm not pretending that, oh, like, let me just off the top of my head, and if I get it right, that I'm just some I'm not some historic genius. I didn't go read all that stuff. But I want to think $89.99, was that
Wow,
it?
bullseye. $89.99 was the price, which in 2024 that's about $230. That's
Whoo.
kind of depressing.
I mean, not only did you like the temptation is to do $99.99, right? It's like, well, it's not $100, but to really undercut that by another 10 is pretty sweet. And then you think of the price of the average Nintendo game. That was I seem to remember some Nintendo games they would be 50, 60, some maybe 70.
Mm-hmm.
So having a whole system that's not that much more than a new Nintendo game, that's pretty appealing.
Yeah. And the sales really kind of supported that because it sold out in Japan in the first 2 weeks. And then it reached the million unit milestone in the US within the first few weeks, according to I don't know if you were among the Game Informer editors who had this on their desk. Steve Kent's book, The Ultimate History of Video Games. So I highly recommend that book if you're interested in that topic. I don't think you can see it on my bookshelf. I see it on my
Is that
bookshelf.
the book that I read that has a big chunk of it dedicated to Tetris?
Maybe.
That might be the one that I read. It's been a
Only
little
you know in
while.
your heart.
It's been a little while, but
Yeah.
the one I did was like kind of a lot of Nintendo, of course, and then big chunks dedicated to Tetris. And I was like, this must be what that movie's about.
But yeah, highly recommend that. Steve Kent's The Ultimate History of Video Games. Great resource. Um, so let's run down the I would say, most important Game Boy games. And you just tell me if there's any you want to talk about in any kind of depth. So the launch titles, Super Mario Land and Tetris, hitting in 1989. We've already touched on both of those a little bit. Both of those are available on Nintendo Switch Online. Dr. Mario came out in 1990. That is also on Nintendo Switch Online. Metroid 2, Return of Samus, 1991. I know you're a Metroid guy. You were on the Super Metroid episode last. Thoughts on Metroid 2?
Well, do you want me to tell you about my thoughts about Metroid 2 now or during a certain top 5 segment?
Oh, okay. Well, let's hold off then. That is
There
available.
might be some crossover there.
So that is also available on Nintendo Switch Online. It was also remade for the 3DS if you want to go play Metroid Samus Returns. 1992 Kirby's Dream Land on Nintendo Switch Online.
Now that
Super
was
Mario.
the debut of Kirby,
It
correct?
was, and a young designer known as Sakurai. Um,
Yes, an
who
early
went
HAL title. Fun note, since he debuted on Game Boy, there wasn't an established color for Kirby just yet. And everyone probably knows this if they listen to your Nintendo podcast. But Kirby was what color on the cover of the Game Boy box?
He was white.
That's right.
Yes, because there was no, like, nowadays it's like, oh yeah, he's a pink puffball. And it wasn't the case back then. It was just like, because the Game Boy was black and white, so nobody knew what color he actually was.
It wasn't until he was on NES in color, right, that he got his signature pink, right?
I believe so, yeah. But that was Masahiro Sakurai's first game. Not a bad debut. So creator of Kirby, created that, and then eventually would go on to create the Super Smash Brothers series. And Kirby has appeared in every single one of those games. Also, I believe Satoru Iwata was the producer of all those early Kirby games because he was with HAL at the time.
Oh, that's right.
So yeah, that's quite a team they had there. Kirby's Dream Land on Nintendo Switch Online. Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins available on Nintendo Switch Online. Let's see. What do we have next? The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, 1993. I believe there's only one version of this available on Nintendo Switch Online. There's a remake of this on Nintendo Switch, a modern remake. And then there's also this is a Game Boy Color game, but they kind of made a Link to the Past semi in this style, semi in Oracle of Ages style in for Game Boy Color, and they also included the Four Swords Adventure game in that. So
This was Link's Awakening DX. Is that correct?
Yeah, Link's Awakening DX is the Game Boy Color version that added I want to say it was an extra dungeon and then also the color graphics.
Indeed.
But DX is available on Nintendo Switch Online. Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3, 1994, not available on Switch Online. I actually never played Wario Land. Did you?
I did. It may not be on Switch Online due to Nintendo's weird way of rolling or not rolling over libraries, but I believe on 3DS they had a Game Boy shop.
Mm-hmm.
And on that, I was able to play a lot of Game Boy hits that I'd never experienced when they originally came out. So went through the entire Super Mario Land series until it changed over to Wario and then started playing the Wario games. But that was a pretty bold zigzag away from the core kind of Mario series. And I think Wario in general was really well suited for Game Boy because he's just like this gigantic sprite and you can see it really easily on the screen. Instead of focusing on tight Mario style platforming, which could be tricky, especially if you're trying to go fast on that dot matrix screen and it blurs out. Like you just need that Wario bruiser that just smashes his shoulders into things. And maybe doesn't move quite as fast.
Yeah, and they kind of did what they did with Yoshi, right? And that was in 1991, Super Mario World came out, and then a few years later, Yoshi's Island came out as Super Mario World 2, but it really wasn't like a game starring Mario, even though it had Super Mario World in the title, it was starring Yoshi. And that's kind of what they did with this game, where it was like, okay, this is Super Mario Land 3, but it's starring Wario. It's not starring Mario. And that's kind of cool. And they both of those games also have a parallel in that they started two different spin-off franchises, because then Wario Land became its own thing, and then the Wario franchise became its own thing, just the way that the Yoshi series kind of was birthed out of Yoshi's Island.
I don't recognize the Super Mario World 2 name as part of Yoshi's Island. It's nothing to do with Super Mario World, and there's yet to be a true sequel to Super Mario World. Yoshi's Island is a different game, and I will never accept it as anything to do with Super Mario World.
Even though we have quotes from both Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka saying that they consider it Super Mario World 2 and a true mainline Mario game.
Nope.
Okay, fair enough.
It's all marketing. Why didn't they call it that in Japan then?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And then every release after is just called Yoshi's Island.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it was Tezuka who was like, yeah, we consider this part of the Mario franchise. And then from this point, Yoshi went off and had his own series.
Yeah. Every time they re-release it, they just call it Yoshi's Island. Because they know.
That's not
they
entirely
have to say
true.
That. They have to say that because it was all marketing. It's like no one will buy this if it doesn't say Mario on it.
So I hate to tell you this.
They had to throw it on there.
But let's see. What was it called on Game Boy Advance? The Game Boy Advance version was called, I believe it was just called Super Mario Advance 3 Yoshi's Island or something.
Yes.
It had Super Mario Advance in the title.
Uh-huh.
So it's a Super Mario game
So
then,
they
right?
cut off Super Mario World 2 because they know that it's not true. And in Japan, it was called Super Mario Yoshi's Island, which I would accept.
Okay.
I would accept that name over trying to say it's a sequel to Super Mario World, the most perfect Mario game ever created.
Hey, I'm a Super Mario World sicko, so I'm right there with you. So do you not consider Wario Land a Mario Land game?
I think it works because he's just like a weirdo that wanted to take over the Mario game. It makes sense that he's just like butting in there. Um, I accept what Wario has done. Um,
I
but
accept what
I
Wario is.
agree that it's a similar situation. But um, but if they happen to change it in subsequent releases to just be called Wario Land, I don't think anyone would bat an eye.
It is interesting that the Game Informer list that I did head up, where we ranked all the Mario games, we do have Yoshi's Island on that list, but we don't have Wario Land on that list.
Hmm.
It is a little bit inconsistent. I will acknowledge that.
When did you guys do that?
2017. I think it was in the lead up to Odyssey.
Interesting. Very interesting.
But Wario Land, not on Nintendo Switch Online. That same year, 1994, Bryan Vore, we got the Super Game Boy. And this was a device, it was a cartridge, a souped up cartridge that you could plug into your Super Nintendo's cartridge port. And then there was a slot for a Game Boy cartridge, and you could plug that in. And it was essentially a way to play Game Boy games up on your TV screen. And they'd be in color too. They'd be up on the big screen, blown up to full TV size. This is the way I experienced most Game Boy games when I was younger, before I had a Game Boy Color. I had a Super Game Boy that I bought at like a local used game store, and I had the time of my life with this thing. I played the crap out of it. Your experience with the Super Game Boy, you alluded to it earlier in the episode. What was it like playing these games up on the screen for the first time?
Oh, it was crazy. Like all these Game Boy games that I'd heard so much about, and it's like, oh, finally, the way I want to play them with like a real controller that I like. Um, you know, none of the blurring. It aligned perfectly with the Game Boy Color, adding at least some color to the screen. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I didn't ask for much, but I did like touches like that, like being able to see what was happening. And TVs are obviously backlit, so that was nice. And just I think people had a hard time picturing like there was no way to just like emulate Game Boy on your computer and have that blown up. Like seeing these sprites this big for the first time was incredible. And it happened to coincide with the launch of my favorite Game Boy game and one of my favorite games of all time, Donkey Kong 94.
Which was the perfect lead in because that was the next game on the list. Donkey Kong, aka Donkey Kong 94, not available on Nintendo Switch Online, but it sounds like you've already played a lot of it up on the big screen. So we'll touch on it a little bit later on in the show. But what made this version of Donkey Kong so special?
Well, I think the title may have thrown some people off in a different way than Yoshi's Island, uh, taking advantage of and corrupting the legacy of Super Mario World. Um, Donkey Kong was just called Donkey Kong, and I think people were like, there'd been lots of Game Boy ports that were just like, here's an adaptation of an arcade game. So I think you see that in the store without something like adventures added onto the end or something. And you thought, okay, this is just a port of Donkey Kong yet again. And firing up the game for the first time, you're also, you know, you'd be forgiven for assuming it's the same because it is the first four levels of Donkey Kong Arcade. But after you get past that point, it opens up this huge world, tons of levels, like great platforming, uh, and uh, it invented so many staples of what Mario is now, even in the 3D world, like um, his gymnastic abilities, like his
Mm-hmm.
handsprings and flips and everything. Those didn't come from Mario 64. Those came from Donkey Kong 94.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest games on the the Game Boy, and it also was the first game that had enhanced features when you put it in the Super Game Boy. And I mean, it wasn't anything super special, but it had like colors that were specific for that version, and it also had a border that that emulated the original Donkey Kong arcade cabinet to make it look like it you were playing on a Donkey Kong arcade cabinet, which is a very cool idea as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that was so cool. And just great puzzles. Like the perfect mixture of puzzles and platforming. It was one of those games just like Super Mario World where I would completely 100% a save file and then start completely over and just do all three save files and then after a while be like, I why don't I just delete one of these and do another 100%? Like I just couldn't get enough of it. And it went on to spawn, later Mario versus Donkey Kong series, um, the minis. Uh, it was, but it was this was really it when it was in its purest form. Like, um, and I loved some of those later games too, especially the earlier um, stuff that came out on Game Boy Advance and all that. And I still have to play that new Mario vs. Donkey Kong remake on Switch. Have you tried that?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, if you played the Game Boy Advance version, this is obviously a remake of that. But it looks great in action and the controls feel awesome. So, yeah, highly recommend that if you liked the Mario vs. Donkey Kong original entry on Game Boy Advance. Um, but yeah, that that you can't say enough good things about Donkey Kong 94. Kirby's Dream Land 2 is another game that I really love. It was the one that made me be like, oh, Kirby is actually a very good franchise. I remember playing the first Kirby game and I beat it in like one sitting and being like, oh, that's it? Like I'm done with this game? Kirby's Dream Land 2 felt like a fully fleshed out game that like it was like a full adventure, right? It wasn't just like a 2 hour jaunt through this world. It was like a full game that had me wanting to play more and more and it gave me so many like upgrades and everything. That came out in 1995. That is also on Nintendo Switch Online. Did you ever play Donkey Kong Land? That came out in 1995 on the Game Boy.
I didn't play it until maybe a few years ago, actually, because my wife was like, that was one of they were not allowed to get a Nintendo, and there was a family of 5 kids,
Mm.
but they were for some reason allowed to get a Game Boy, and then they all were like fighting over it. So, but but one of the games they had was Donkey Kong Land. So my wife was just like, this is the game, like I know it inside and out. And so we fired up a version of that and played through it, and she like knew all the secrets and all that stuff, and eventually played Donkey Kong Country, and she was like, oh, this is so weird. But there was a lot of stuff that was very similar, so she still knew a lot of the tricks for it. But it's funny to have someone like with so many memories of Donkey Kong Land, which is kind of a interesting approximation of the Super Nintendo game.
Yeah. I remember seeing that and being like, those are the graphics on the Game Boy? Kind of like the similar way I was with Donkey Kong Country on the SNES, because like they still tried to do kind of like that pseudo 3D effect, but on Game Boy, which is just a wildly ambitious thing. I mean, they didn't come anywhere close to like the fidelity that was present in the Super Nintendo versions, but like it was impressive that they could get that, like the visuals that they had on Donkey Kong Land on the Game Boy. It was just
Yes.
very impressive. 1996 in Japan, 1998 in the US came the game that I immediately think of when I think of Game Boy. That is Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. And this was the reason I got a Game Boy Color. It was, I remember getting into the Pokemon franchise through like the anime and the cards, and then being like, oh, I want to try the video game too. And then that just blew my mind. And that was my first RPG. And it was just everything to me. I beat it over and over and over again. I would alternate between playing it on my Game Boy and playing it up on the Super Game Boy because, like, if we're going somewhere, I'll bring it on the Game Boy. I remember I would go to restaurants with my family and I would bring my Game Boy to the table because I was that sucked into Pokemon. And I remember my parents went through this phase of wanting to go to buffets, and I would be upset that we would go to buffets because there was no wait period between when you would sit down and when like you could get food. So I'd have to put the system away. So we'd sit down at like Golden Corral or something, and it would be like, oh man, I don't even have time to play my game now because I got to go get food immediately. um, this was also the game that I went to a park when I was at my grandparents' house, and I was playing my Game Boy and I was on a seesaw with my cousin, and I was holding the Game Boy with both hands, and I got to the top because I didn't want to let go of the Game Boy, and reach the top, and kind of jarring when it hits the top, and like you hit the bottom, it's kind of like a dead stop. It's not like you're easing into a stop. And when I hit that dead stop, rather than holding on to the handle, I just kind of rotated and fell to the ground.
Oh my.
Fell onto the wood chips below. The Game Boy was okay. I had a couple of like scuffs on my arm, but that's a memory that sticks with me about how like hooked I was on the Pokemon games. I adored these games. I think it's safe to say that Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow especially were kind of like those life-changing, like life direction altering games that I played when I was a kid, and just like I was never the same after playing it.
Yeah, it was perfectly timed because the Game Boy Color it brought that form factor down, right? It took it from less of a brick shape and kind of squeezed it down into a nice small form factor. And it was like how many different launch colors that were like, it was kind of like what you would see later that Apple would do with their iMacs or, with iPods, where they would just have this variety of fun rainbow colors instead of kind of the dreary gray. And then, finally incorporating some color. It wasn't a ton. It was like what, 4 colors at a time or something?
What, Game Boy
like
Color?
Yeah.
Oh, we'll get into it a little bit, but like it was actually a lot of colors. You'd be surprised how many colors that thing could display.
Well, I mean simultaneously, right? Was it
56 simultaneously, I believe.
really? Oof. Okay. All right.
And then the Pokemon games, famously not on Nintendo Switch Online, which is just absurd to me that maybe the most popular games on the system are not brought over to Nintendo Switch Online.
If only they would remake classic Pokemon games and charge full price.
Well, I'm waiting for Fire Red and Leaf Green to come on to Switch Online. Like, we already got Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which aren't I'm happy that we got another modern remake of Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, but like that's not the way that I want them. I want them to not have the weird Pokemon Go inspired motion controls and wild encounters. But I'd still enjoy playing through that story. Honestly, I think it would be cool if they did like, just like, I mean, I don't even know what they could do because so many Pokemon days have come and gone since Nintendo Switch Online brought Game Boy games. And there's not been a single mention of those games coming. We got Pokemon Pinball on Nintendo Switch Online, I think. We got Pokemon Trading Card Game, which, by the way, underrated gem on the Game Boy Color, Pokemon Trading Card Game. It's basically a full-scale Pokemon RPG, only instead of collecting Pokemon, you're opening booster packs of cards that you get from people you defeat, and you bolster your deck and everything. It was an incredible early example of like a deck builder RPG. It was that I replayed that a few years ago, and it still holds up. It's still so much fun. We have that on Nintendo Switch Online, but no Pokemon mainline RPGs, which is such a bummer. One of
That
the
is
greatest games of all
so
time, I think.
strange.
I know.
So strange.
And did you have a personal affection for those games?
You know, I don't know what it was. I think, well, the first ones came out, I might have not have been fully accepting of RPGs yet. Um, I had some friends who played RPGs, and I was like, what is this? You just stand around and select different menus to attack? Like, I want to actively beat people up, like in Street Fighter or, Mario jumping on someone's head. So I didn't really understand kind of the turn based and strategy style. But just as Square had planned, I finally sat down with a little old game called Mystic Quest on Super Nintendo with a
Oh,
buddy of mine. This was the guy who was into RPGs. And I think he was just like, oh, it's another RPG. But to me, it was like, okay, this breaks things down very simply. And I kind of, I think we tried to beat it all in like a weekend or something.
hmm.
And I finally was like, simplified options, not a lot of party members, uh, a very prescripted linear path. Um, so that actually worked on me. Like, I know a lot of people like to make fun of Mystic Quest as like a baby's RPG, but it kind of explains the language of an RPG to me who I had been very against it before, and then from then on, like I definitely went down the rabbit hole of a lot of the classic RPGs at that time.
Yeah, I mean,
But
Pokemon.
I think
Pokemon was
something
my
about
first RPG.
Pokemon was I was like, I don't want to wait and press menus, but I think if I would have given it a chance, I would have been pretty hooked, just like you were.
Yep, that certainly is what happened with me. Shout out to one of my favorite games of all time, Pokemon Red/Blue/Yellow. And then the final game we're going to highlight on this timeline is the Game and Watch Gallery. Kind of coming full circle here, Brian. We started this episode talking about Game and Watch being so influential to the Game Boy. And here they are paying homage to it with a series of galleries that just took those around 60 games and put them into these three different collections. There's Game & Watch Gallery 1, 2, and 3. Game & Watch Gallery 1, I remember going to, I believe it was my local Sears, and buying this one and being like, oh, what's this? Like Game and Watch. I think I read in like Nintendo Power. It's like, oh, this was like a really influential thing from like Nintendo's early days in gaming. I was like, oh, that's got to be awesome. And I was like, oh, these are just like tiny little games that I'm done with in like 25 seconds and being very disappointed. It's like, oh, these are very much like those Tiger Electronic games you pointed out. But Game & Watch Gallery 1 is not on Nintendo Switch Online, but Game & Watch Gallery 3 is for some reason. So I don't know what the reasoning behind that is. So on top of these games, Brian, we also got a few system revisions. We'll run down these fairly quickly. In 1995, we got Play It Loud edition. So you may have remembered the Play It Loud campaign that Nintendo had launched to kind of compete with the Genesis in your face kind of marketing that they were doing. This was their kind of attempt to be a little edgy with their marketing and like appeal to like the Gen X demographic, and like Donkey Kong Country was like a big part of this. But they also had the Play It Loud, which was just a regular Game Boy with special edition like colorful cases. There was also one that was completely transparent, which is very, very 90s. In 1996, a year later, they released the Game Boy Pocket, which was probably the biggest revision, I would argue, because it drastically shrunk the size of the system, making it so that, as the name implies, fits in your pocket. And then it also made it so it only required two AA batteries, and it made the screen a new type of LCD film, which got rid of the yellow background, and it made it a lot clearer as well, and that version retailed for $70 when it came out. In 1998, in Japan only, we got the Game Boy Light, which gave us the long-awaited backlit version of the Game Boy, and it was slightly bigger than the Pocket, but it was still pretty small and able to fit in most pockets. It had the backlight and a slightly better battery life than the Pocket, even though it had that backlight, and you could turn the light on or off. Um, did you really need me to say that it had a backlight after saying that it had you know uh, it was called the Game Boy Light? I don't think Nintendo ever confirmed that this is the reason, but rampant online speculation based on my research suggests that it never came to the US because the next generation was right around the corner, which was 1998's Game Boy Color. That was on November 18th, 1998, and it felt more like a revision than the new generation, but if you look at like the way it was marketed, it absolutely was the next generation of Game Boy, because same form factor as Game Boy Pocket largely, but it could display games on a spectrum of, get this, Brian, 32,768 colors,
Heyo.
with the capability of displaying 56 at once. But still, for whatever reason, no backlight, even though they had the Game Boy Light right before that. I don't understand why they continued to do that.
That's infuriating because they figured it out. And then they did it again with the first Game Boy Advance.
Yeah. So Game Boy Color, it gave us a new library of games that could only be played on Game Boy Color, which is why I'm saying it's next gen, because, if it was just a revision, you'd be able to play all those games on there, I feel. But then again, we have like new Nintendo 3DS, which was absolutely a revision, but it had some exclusive games, very few exclusive games, but still some exclusive games. Game Boy Color was definitely a next-gen Game Boy, though. So we're not going to go in depth with these, but some of the popular Game Boy Color games were Pokemon Gold, Silver, Crystal, Pokemon Pinball, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, Zelda Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, Wario Land 3, and several others. And there are also several Game Boy Color games on the Nintendo Switch Online catalog, but they're just lumped in with the Game Boy library, which may be counter to my argument this is a next generation thing. But that's really where your nostalgia is located, right? Like, you love the Game Boy Color, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, it's solely because of Donkey Kong 94 being totally excellent. I was always confused by Game Boy Color because I was like, wait, so carts you couldn't put in an old Game Boy and play them? Would they not even fit?
No, they would fit. They just weren't. They wouldn't boot up.
They would just have some weird error message or something.
I believe so.
Oh, okay.
But you could do the other way around, though, because it was backward compatible with original Game Boy games, which was pretty novel at the time, because an SNES couldn't play NES games.
Yeah, that was smart of them to do, because you have that amazing huge library, and people could be encouraged to make the next step forward, but also not have to worry about getting rid of or losing access to all their games.
Mm-hmm. That was a big complaint that people had going from the NES to the SNES. Was like, what? So all my old games are just useless now? I put like hundreds of dollars into this, and what? I just have to like get rid of them or keep two video game systems, God forbid, plugged into the same TV? Which I guess that was a valid complaint, seeing as how like the inputs were not nearly as advanced as they are now. Like, back then it was like TVs had like a VCR and that was it. Or
yeah,
a cable box.
Maybe a cable or satellite box. Yeah. It's interesting to see it. Whereas with Game Boy, they made that smart choice, but for home consoles, it wasn't really until the CD-ROMs that they were like, okay, backwards compatibility is important to us and we will be sure to do it. Like when it was Nintendo, NES, Super Nintendo, and 64, there was not even the slightest seeming consideration to have backwards compatibility.
I mean, the first backward compatible Nintendo console was the Wii, being able to play GameCube discs.
Yeah.
And even then, you still needed to have your GameCube controller and plug it into the top of the Wii. I think that's the thing that a lot of people forget is the Wii had 4 GameCube controller ports on the top of it, kind of hidden beneath a panel.
Yeah, I mean that's a huge investment, like 4 controller ports just for backwards compatibility and nothing else, really, right?
Yeah. Remember when the PlayStation 3's first generation was backward compatible with PS2? And from what I understand, it caused so many problems with like the hardware. And that's why if I'm not mistaken, that's one of the main contributors to that yellow light of death that PS3 launch models had. And it was also prohibitively expensive. That's why why the price was so high at launch was because the PS2 infrastructure was so different from the PS3. And they're like, oh, after this first launch model, we are done with PS2 backward compatibility. And that's why those PS3s, that launch edition PS3, were so sought after for the longest time, is because, oh my God, they can play PS2 games as well.
Yeah, from what I understand, they essentially had to put a PS2 inside of the PS3
They did.
to get that to work, which explains why it was enormous, crazy heavy. I actually I still have one of those. I don't know if it works or not, but I have one. I was like, you know what? I work at a gaming magazine. We're going to get the opportunity to play. That was always my justification of buying systems right away when I was there, at least. It's like, we're going to get the opportunity to have access to these launch games and see like the cutting edge technology. And I can play them in HD,
Ooh.
720p, 1080p. I mean, come on, watch out.
Possibilities are endless.
Yeah. Utilize that like one HDMI port on my DLP. So, really testing that, putting that TV through its paces.
And then Nintendo wasn't HD until 2012.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about, but at least, they got there.
They did. Eventually they got there. It is funny looking back, like, because, I put some gameplay footage for some of the video episodes of this podcast, and going back to like the 3DS footage, it's like, oh, this is hard to look at. Or even the Wii footage is sometimes hard to look at, like when you're so used to the onslaught of like super high def trailers that we get nowadays. Just throwing it up on the exact same monitor on my computer as the God of War Ragnarok trailer. It's like, oh my God, this is a completely different era, but it still feels like it was just yesterday.
Yeah.
So let's run down the best-selling games of Game Boy here. These are just OG Game Boy, not Game Boy Color. So Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, 46 million units. That's very respectable.
Well,
Tetris,
another genius move there was that was the first game to do those like alternate
the
versions
split
of
release,
the same game.
And they were like, oh, if you want all the Pokemon, you gotta get both of them, or like have a friend that has both of them, and also buy the link cable.
Yeah, and then Yellow came out later, right? And that had even more new Pokemon.
Well, it wasn't even more Pokemon, but it was like you could have Pikachu as your starter, which at that point, Pikachu was like a god because he was like exploding in popularity. Because a lot of people forget that like Pikachu was not the original mascot of Pokemon. It was Clefairy was intended to be the mascot of Pokemon. And then Pikachu, like if you read the old manga, the old Pokemon manga, the partner Pokemon is actually Clefairy, which is hilarious. And then because of the anime and because of his popularity as a monster in Pokemon Red and Blue, they decide, oh, well, we should really play off the popularity of Pikachu. And they put the special Pikachu edition, which was what the subtitle of Pokemon Yellow was. They put that out. And then, from there, it was just a rocket ship to the moon with that character's popularity.
That was smart.
That was very smart. And then also incorporated elements of the anime. So like, you started off with Pikachu as your partner. Instead of just generic Team Rocket characters, it was Jesse and James. And then it was also like you could get all the original starters on your team in similar locations as happened in the anime. So that was like such a smart way to like loosely adapt the story of the anime with several of the characters that were created for the anime that didn't appear in the original Red and Blue.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, I remember playing that and being like, because I used to just hack the crap out of Pokemon Red and Blue with like Game Genie. It was either Game Genie or Game. I think it was Game Genie on the Game Boy, and then I had
Ooh, I had that for NES and Super Nintendo, but I never tried the Game Boy one. What
oh, it
kind
was
of
so
crazy
good.
stuff could you do with that thing?
So you could do it so you could just like put in a certain line of code, and it would make it so that whatever Pokemon you wanted to appear would appear. Like so, I could put in an input and be like, all right, I want Mew to appear, which you couldn't get Mew by normal means in Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. So I would put in like, I want Mew to be every wild Pokemon that I encounter. So like if you're in Pallet Town and you go up into the tall grass, that level 2 Pidgey that usually pops out is a level 2 Mew. And I would just do that, and I would build out like this super team of like, all right, well, I have Dragonite, I have Mew, I have Alakazam, I have Gengar, I have Mewtwo, and then like, fill it out with another Pokemon and just be like, I have Charizard. And that was like my team. And, or I would replicate Ash's team from the anime where I'd have like Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur, Pidgeotto, Pikachu, and then whatever his other rotating Pokemon. He was usually Butterfree, and I would just have that be my team for the entire game because it was just so much fun to do that. You could also like modify the stats of the Pokemon. You could make it so that no matter how you like the Pokemon never escape from the Pokeballs. It was a lot of fun to like just mod the crap out of that. So I used Game Genie on the Game Boy, and then I used Game Shark on the Genesis, and I would have fun with like that on like the Sonic games. Like I replayed infinitely with different codes in that thing. Those were the days. I loved those games so much with the cheat codes.
Yeah, you could really just play, and like sometimes it would be like, oh, infinite lives, but sometimes it would just be like the weirdest hacks
Mm-hmm.
that you could, and just like see the inner workings of the game. So it was very cool. But did you, I guess the internet was far enough along, is that where you got a lot of that? Because the early NES Game Genie stuff, there was no internet.
You had
So
to
I had
buy
to
a
like,
book.
yeah, you'd be subscribing to this book that would come out quarterly maybe, and just hope the games that you cared about were in there and that you owned, and like that the codes would be good. So I'm sure like now like people have figured out so many cool like retro things that a fake emulated Game Genie could do to games, but like
Oh, I'm sure.
at the time you were at the mercy of those booklets.
Yeah, I think I got a few of the booklets at my local Borders Books, and it was just called like the official Game Genie handbook or something, and it had like the little like genie guy holding up the Game Genie logo, that the logo that they had, and it was it was really cool to be like, oh wow, if I buy this game, I can do this in this game, and like sometimes I would be like, oh, maybe I should buy that because I could do this cool cheat code, and I was like, I'm not going to buy a game just so I could try out a cheat code. So I would for Genesis, because I don't think my local rental store had Game Boy games you could rent because I think they were afraid people were just going to like never return them because they were so small. But like Genesis cartridges you could rent, and I would just rent games just to see what kinds of like craziness I could pull off using the Game Shark that I had.
Nice. Did
Um,
you did you for the Game Boy, like, God, I can see how that would be really fun to just totally play around in
Especially in a game
Pokemon.
like Pokemon.
Yeah, so did that help? Like, would a normal person have to start out completely over if they wanted to buy Yellow when it came out, or could you pull in your Pokemon from your previous save?
I mean, you could do, if you had two Game Boys, you could do a link cable trade
So trade all your old roster up to the Yellow.
if you wanted to, but then also Pokemon had a built-in safety mechanism where you had to have a badge of a certain level or else the Pokemon probably wouldn't obey you. So if I had like a level 100 Charizard and I traded it to my brand new save file, I probably wouldn't be able to use that Charizard until I had the final gym badge, which granted obedience to all Pokemon of all levels.
Ah,
So they had like a built-in mechanism. They knew like people would be like, "Hey, I just got this Pokemon game. you beat it like 3 months ago. Can you trade me your three most powerful creatures? And you're done playing it. So just send it over to me. And then like, that would make it so that it would just be an easy, it would be an easy playthrough. And they put in a mechanism. Like sometimes they would obey, and other times it would just be like Charizard refuses to obey. And that would be how they fixed that.
Oh, okay.
Smart foresight.
Yeah. So how many times do you think you played that through all the way?
Oh man.
Did you buy all 3 copies, or did you trade with friends?
No, I bought all 3 copies. So I got Pokemon Blue for Christmas alongside the Game Boy Color, which was a very, very good Christmas. And then I want to say I saved up my allowance and I bought Red shortly thereafter, even though it's basically an identical game, but I wanted the other Pokemon. And then when Yellow came out, I still remember going into, I think it was a Toys R Us, and like getting it day one and just being ecstatic when like I fired it up and like the big like main screen, like the main menu screen, the start screen had Pikachu's big face, and like you hit it and like the very digitized version of him saying his name instead of, because he like actually said Pika instead of like his digitized cry that they all have.
Mm.
So like that was also like amazing to me because the things that blew our minds in like the mid to late 90s were wild. Like I remember Pokemon Stadium was like on N64 was like the big one for me, where it was like, oh my god, they almost look like they do in the anime. This is incredible.
Yeah, that's a big. I'm surprised they never did a real Pokemon. They didn't do a real Pokemon game on N64, did they?
No, GameCube they had an RPG that wasn't considered mainline. Pokemon XD, was it Gale of Darkness? But that is a full RPG on GameCube, but it's not considered a mainline entry. Like, it's not like a generation entry. The first mainline entry was on was Sword and Shield on Switch.
Oh man,
Yeah,
that took a while. But I guess Switch is half portable anyway, so that's kind of the way it
I mean,
goes.
Pokemon really had no choice. They either developed for a console or they stopped developing for Nintendo systems because there was no dedicated handheld device at that point. But yeah, let's run down the remaining top 10 best selling. So I already said Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow, 46 million. Tetris, which was bundled in with a lot of Game Boys, 35 million. Super
Hmm.
Mario Land, 29.4 million. We're not going to do specifics after the top three. 4, Super Mario Land 2. 5, Dr. Mario. Then Wario Land, Super Mario Land 3. Kirby's Dream Land, Donkey Kong Land, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, and then F1 Race, which I don't know anything about, but that was surprising that that's a top 10 selling game on Game Boy.
Are these worldwide or US numbers?
Worldwide.
I wonder if the Europeans really knocked that F1 game up.
It's entirely possible.
Hmm.
And then the original Game Boy family, which does include Game Boy Color, went on to sell over 118 million units, making it currently the 4th best-selling video game system of all time. And at the time of the Game Boy Color's discontinuation in 2003, that family of systems was the best-selling video game system of all time. Today, it has been passed by the PlayStation 2, Nintendo DS, and Nintendo Switch. So the Game Boy branding did continue, as you've alluded to a few times here, into the 2000s with the Game Boy Advance line of handhelds that initially launched in 2001, before the brand was finally retired in 2004 with the launch of the Nintendo DS as the company's new flagship handheld device. And then kind of a Where Are They Now segment here. We covered this in the Super Metroid episode that you were also a part of, but Gunpei Yokoi left Nintendo shortly after the failure of the Virtual Boy, which he created. In his time with Nintendo, on top of the stuff we covered in this episode, he also designed Duck Hunt, created the Super Scope, created Rob the Robot, and was a producer on Donkey Kong Jr., the original Mario Brothers, Balloon Fight, Metroid, Kid Icarus, several Fire Emblem games in the early era of that series, Dr. Mario, Metroid 2, Mario Paint, Super Mario Land 2, and Yoshi's Cookie. He also supervised development on Super Metroid. And he was with Nintendo for 31 years. After leaving in 1996, he formed a company called Koto and worked on a Bandai handheld called the Wonder Swan. And then, unfortunately, in 1997, he died just over a year after leaving Nintendo because he was involved in a fender bender on a Japanese highway and then was subsequently struck by another passing car. And he ended up dying shortly thereafter. So, absolutely tragic there. I found a 2006 interview with PC Watch, which, again, through Internet Archive, seemingly a defunct Japanese website. And this was with Satoru Iwata, former president, again, the late former president of Nintendo. He said, quote, Nintendo had that way of thinking from the beginning. Yokoi, who created the Game Boy, left behind the phrase lateral thinking of obsolete technology. He said that you use obsolete technology and compete with ideas. Miyamoto also inherited that way of thinking because Yokoi was his mentor. It just so happened that I took on the role of president in this kind of era and found that such a tradition existed within the company. In that case, I thought that Nintendo, with its kind of corporate culture, should be the place for me to take on this role. Just kind of talking about the reason that he wanted to take his role as president. It sounds like Gunpei Yokoi was instrumental not only in Shigeru Miyamoto's career, but also in bringing Satoru Iwata over to Nintendo from HAL Laboratory to be Nintendo's president. So you look at the kind of the Mount Rushmore of Nintendo figures, and I think a lot of people probably think of like Miyamoto, Tezuka, Aonuma, and Iwata as kind of the most important figures in Nintendo's history. But like after this episode and the Super Metroid episode that we both were on, it really seems like hard to dispute that Yokoi probably deserves a spot in the Nintendo Mount Rushmore. Like he's just done so much stuff in his career. Like the Game Boy is probably his crowning achievement, being a part of that team. But like you heard all the stuff that I listed off, like he's got to be on there, right?
Oh, for sure. And really taking Nintendo into a more technological toy era with those early inventions you talked about. I mean that
The Ultra Hand.
Ultra Hand was a huge hit. The light rifle, like the beam rifle, like those were pretty big breakout hits in the day, and really helped convince Yamauchi to go more into that direction. So we owe a lot to Yokoi for sure.
Absolutely. And then, meanwhile, the other man that we talked a lot about, Satoru Okada, worked for Nintendo until 2012, and he played instrumental roles in the creation of the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Advance SP, and the Nintendo DS. And you may remember that Okada got his way with the design of the Game Boy, but based on the stuff that I read, it appears that that was not the case with the DS because he did not want two screens on it. But I found an article on Kotaku, and then President Hiroshi Yamauchi overrode his objections. Like basically, he went to Yamauchi and was like, "I don't think that we should do a handheld with two screens on it." And Yamauchi was like, "Too bad, we're doing it."
Yeah, it's funny to think about the DS. I'm sure there'll be an anniversary for that for you at some point. But it's funny to think back, like a touchscreen was not common at all, especially in gaming. And just to think how essential it's become ever since, not only with the popularity of the DS and 3DS, but of course, phone gaming. Like touchscreen has been such a key way that we interact with games now, and it all started there. It's just another Nintendo innovation that really just changed everything.
Absolutely. And then on top of that hardware stuff that we talked about, Okada was also the chief director of Metroid 1 and the director of Kid Icarus, Wrecking Crew, and others. And I can't really find too much about what he's up to these days, but it seems like he's just enjoying retired life in Japan. And then I found a 2022 interview with 4gamer.net, translated again by Shmupulations. Okada said, quote, when I quit Nintendo, Iwata came to me and said, I've seen many people come and go over the years here, and most are lucky to have had just one or two hits in their career. Please tell me your secret. How do you keep putting out hits? But all I could say in reply was, I don't know. And then he laughs. When I think back now, I realize that while I was often ordered to do this or that by management, those tasks that I thought were a waste of time, I just didn't do. I would avoid it by pretending to do it. Which again, it seems like he's kind of like, yeah, like screw kind of like the corporate uh weirdness that comes with a lot of these jobs. And like he seemed very like disenchanted by the direction that like not only Nintendo but just the games industry in general was taking to kind of get rid of like those grassroots ideas, like he did with the link cable, where he just like, I believe in this idea so much, I'm going to make prototype games and a working link cable to show management that it's a cool idea that we could easily make for the Game Boy. And he seems like to think that that's not going to happen anymore, and he seems very over that. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that he retired and was like, yeah, I think I don't need this in my life anymore.
Yeah, I can see it. I know the perception that Japanese businessmen like work to the bone is probably very true in the Nintendo case too. So I'm glad he's gotten some relaxation in.
Yeah. So we're going to take a quick break here, Brian. And when we get back, we're going to do a quick definitive ranking, and then we're going to get out of here. We will be right back. We are back, and it is time for Definitive Ranking, a recurring segment where we take a Nintendo topic and give our own personal top 5 lists. Since this episode was an exhaustive history of the Game Boy, this definitive ranking list pretty much wrote itself. Brian, I want to get your top 5 Game Boy games. So start at 5, count it down to 1. Give me a quick sentence or two about each.
Okay. For me, number 5, Super Mario Land. It's so weird and so different than on other Mario games. It's got the side-scrolling shooter stuff. It's got, I believe, like a Sphinx boss.
Yep.
It's so weird. It's quick in and out, and it's a surprising time early on when Miyamoto was not really involved in a full-on Mario game. So that was fun. Are we putting these back and forth, or should I just keep going?
No, just roll it down. Roll down the whole list.
Another one that I didn't play until later is Mario's Picross.
Oh,
I would have known about that at the time. I think I would have been very into it. Kind of popularized the Picross, which I didn't really pick up on until the DS era when there was the DS Picross game.
Mm-hmm.
But then when that came out, a lot of the old timers at GI were like, "Oh my god, Mario's Picross was like my favorite Game Boy game. We used to play it in the van when we were driving to shows and all this stuff." You know, like they were obsessed back in the day with it. So it wasn't. I didn't really know about it back in the day at the time, but looking back, it's like so fun, and it was cool that they had all the Nintendo touches to it.
So that's your number 4?
Yep.
All right.
So number 3, Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. I was a big Super Nintendo Zelda fan and NES Zelda fan. So this another one was that I was kind of a going back and like, oh, I always meant to go back and play this, and it's great to experience that for the first time, like a fully new to me top-down Zelda game, and it had such a different. Again, the Game Boy. The fun part about that early Game Boy library is they were not necessarily locked into a lot of conventions on the main console games. So you had like jumping, which was crazy. Yeah, and it was a really cool Zelda game, and it was cool to see it get remade.
Which, by the way, that was present in the remake as well. All the conventions and everything you're talking about, where it's like there's crossover characters. There's like Kirby and Yoshi and all those characters are in Link's Awakening, which really adds to kind of like the dreamlike existence of that game. And then not only that, but like you said, jumping and like side-scrolling segments and everything. And those are actually not only carrying over to Link's Awakening's remake, but the recently announced The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is using some of those conventions as well. So it's super influential. And it was originally going to be a port of A Link to the Past to the Game Boy. And then they were like, I don't think this is possible, guys. I think we should just make it its own game. So they started doing that as like a side project. And then it ended up got to the point where they're like, we should probably pitch this in an official capacity. And then they did, and it turned out to be one of the most classic games in the entire Game Boy catalog.
Yeah, it worked out well that I'm sure that they developed a significant degree of it so that it would help with the pitch.
Mm-hmm.
So that was cool. For me, number 2, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, appropriately. Is this the best Metroid game ever? No, but I was so curious about it because Super Metroid had such a heavy reference to it in the
Mm-hmm.
awesome cinematic intro. And really throughout the whole game, like considering Metroid 1 and 2 so much in the story, which games really didn't do that, especially franchises like Mario 1 and 2. There's no thread connecting them. 2 and 3, no thread there. Like games really didn't have a narrative connection, and to see that used so strongly in Super Metroid, I was like, gosh, man, I really should go back and play this. Um, Fortunately, I tried it with save states and stuff and like having some kind of ASCII map of where things were, because I think it would have been easy to get lost. And at least I believe this did have a battery save, unlike Metroid 1.
Mm-hmm.
So that went a long way. Um, and it was very zoomed in. Like, it's the thing about the NES Metroid, it felt like the world was wide around you, but Metroid 2, it's so zoomed in and the characters are so big that you can get surprised by enemies a lot.
Yeah, and they the remake, because like Super Metroid, as we covered in the Super Metroid episode, was the one that introduced so many of the conventions that we now know as like not only a Metroid staple but a Metroidvania staple, like the entire genre at large, like the map being built out. Like you said, you had an ASCII map to like help you navigate that. That was something that was not really a thing for the first two Metroid games, but Super Metroid kind of changed all of that when it came out. But yeah, Metroid 2, one of the better remakes on 3DS, and I wish they would bring it to Switch, but because that would be amazing, because we just recently got Metroid Zero Mission on Game Boy Advance, Nintendo Switch Online, so it would be cool to have both of the first two remakes that like bring it up to modern conventions on Switch, so that way we could experience both of those games. Because Metroid 2 is on Switch Online for Game Boy, but I have a feeling a lot of people who are just like, hey, I want to see what this Metroid 2 game's all about, are not going to have a great time going back and playing Metroid 2 on Game Boy. I think they would need to play Metroid Samus Returns on 3DS to really appreciate it in the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, the best time possible to have done it would have been right before Dread, because that's that same developer and a
Yep.
lot of similarities in gameplay with um the parry, I
The
guess.
parry system, yeah.
Yeah. So I was happy. I think I might have said this in that Metroid episode, but I saved that game to play before Dread. I was like, a new Metroid game. I don't need to knock it out right away, but I did buy it on launch week just to support the production of Metroid games. Uh,
And you did it. You single-handedly are responsible for Dread because you bought the 3DS remake.
yeah, so many years later, and it's it's hard to find that now. Like, I think a lot of people are having that same thought of like, "Ooh, I want to play a Metroid in this style of Dread, or catch up on some different old Metroid before this comes up." And it's not, it's harder to find like a lot of these games since they don't digitally release them on Switch.
It's frustrating, and they closed down the 3DS eShop, so like, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, it's baffling. But to move on, I think it's no surprise that my number one is Donkey Kong 94. It really was. I just couldn't get enough of that game, and thought it was pretty much perfect. I just loved it.
Yeah, that's a solid list, and some expected overlap, but other not as much as I thought. Number 5 is also a Super Mario Land game for me, but I'm going Super Mario Land 2, Six Golden Coins. I think that they had a better grasp on the limitations of the Game Boy, and they were able to make things look a little bit better, play a little bit better. I liked the introduction of Wario on this one as the antagonist. I think the final boss battle against Wario is amazing because he has like all the power ups that you could accumulate over the course of the journey, and he could use them against you, which was a really cool way to kind of send you off on the adventure. And just a really solid handheld Mario game, and like I would say the first truly great handheld Mario game. I think Mario Land was great, like as a proof of concept, but I think that Mario Land 2 is where they really started like cooking with gas.
Oh, no disagreement here. Mario Land 1 was janky as hell and weird. And that's kind of what I liked about it, but I do not begrudge you putting Mario Land 2 above that for sure.
Number 4 for me, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, for the reasons we've already talked about. It's a fantastic top-down Zelda game. The remake is also pretty darn good. I can understand why they would want to remake it for modern systems. I mean, just the ability to equip multiple things because you have more than 2 face buttons on the Switch is a game changer for that. And not to mention the cool art style that everybody hated at first and now in retrospect loves. Number 3, Kirby's Dream Land 2. Again, all the reasons we said before, lots of upgrades over the original Kirby's Dream Land. And then the last 2 are pretty self-explanatory and pretty easy to guess for me. Number 2 is Tetris, and number 1, Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. Just an incredible collection of games there. I have probably beaten those games 9 or 10 times total, if you count all the versions of Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. And I wish they would put it. I mean, they put it out on 3DS. Why can't they put it out on Switch? It's the weirdest thing that I don't know if it's like the Pokemon company refusing to put like its mainline RPGs on a subscription service or what. But like, I wonder, because they put it out on the 3DS because like, you could buy 3DS games individually, whereas you can't buy there's no virtual console anymore. It's just Nintendo Switch Online. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with it. And Nintendo, like maybe Pokemon Company just is afraid that's going to devalue their games. I don't know. That's just a weird thing to me that it's not there, but
it is strange. Was there a weird exception with that Fire Emblem NES era game that finally got translated and released in the US? It was like a limited time, like you can buy it for like we're gonna leave it up for like a few months and you can buy it.
Oh really? I don't remember that.
And we finally localized it for the US. It was like the very first Fire Emblem game, but like they actually allowed that to be, I think, purchased a la carte. So you'd think Pokemon Company's probably got tons of sway, so you think Nintendo could be like, well, yeah, we'll give you guys the opportunity to sell it on its own, because all sides could make tons of money.
Yeah,
just doesn't make any sense.
Think about how many people would rebuy the old Pokemon games, even if they were just like $10 a piece. Like I would go buy probably Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, Pokemon Heart Gold, Soul Silver. Like I could go on and on and on. All the games I would probably buy at least one from every generation, if I'm being honest. And it seems like it would, maybe the DS and 3DS ones would be difficult to port over, given like the having to rearrange the menu so it's not on the touch screen. But there's some way they got to figure that out, right? Like it's wild to me that there's just nothing over there. But we've beaten this horse to death at this point. Bryan, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of All Things Nintendo.
Thanks for having me. It's been a good time going down memory lane.
Yeah, covering one of the greatest handheld devices of all time. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. Do me a favor, if you haven't already, throw All Things Nintendo a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button. If you want to get any questions or comments in, you can get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com. Hit me up on social media at Bryan P. Shea, or leave a comment on the free All Things Nintendo Patreon page. Also, be sure to find All Things Nintendo on YouTube and subscribe to that channel. You can search for All Things Nintendo or just visit at Bryan P. Shea on YouTube. Bryan, tell everybody where they can find you online.
Oh, well, I have like an old Twitter account, Bryan_Vore, but I don't really tweet much. But something that might be interesting to Nintendo fans, I did do a couple articles on this website called Rally. One was about kind of the history of Punch-Out and the crazy records that people are going for in that game. And I also did one on the Famicom Disk System, specifically the sound chips that were in that versus the NES. And then what's fun is, I don't really go into it, but the Game Boy had a weird alternate, like, so, I don't want to get too far into it, but the NES has 2 square channels, a triangle channel, and a noise channel. And then the Famicom Disk System had expanded all that plus a wavetable synthesis. And then Game Boy strangely had 2 squares, skipped the triangle, had a noise channel and a wavetable. So the Game Boy is kind of like a weird combo of the Famicom Disk System's expanded sound system. And it's interesting to see people can use that chip tunes. You see a lot of Game Boys using chiptune live performances because Game Boy's got kind of a really interesting sound chip setup. So, but yeah, the article I did for that is more comparing Zeldas and talking with some experts, an actual chiptune musician, Thomas Cipollone, and Emily Reese, who's is a video game soundtrack expert and has her own podcast as well.
Awesome.
But I can send you those links afterwards.
Yeah, so check the description for links to those articles. That is our show for this week. Thank you again for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time.